Some families break with shouting and slammed doors. Others break in silence, one Christmas at a time. Mine broke the year my mother set the table for 7, knowing only 5 would come. This is not a perfect family story. It's not dramatic for attention. It's just real. And if you've ever sat at a Christmas table feeling full, but empty at the same time, then this story is for you. This is what Christmas means to me. I grew up believing Christmas was a promise that never broke. Every December, without fail, our house filled with the smell of jollof rice simmering on the stove. The sound of my father's old radio playing carols, and the sight of my mother's hands moving steadily through preparations that started days before the actual day. We were not wealthy. My father worked as a school administrator. My mother sold fabrics at the local market, but on Christmas Day, we ate like royalty. The table, there were 7 of us then. My parents, my 3 siblings, Grace, Daniel, and myself. The middle child they called Helen, and my father's mother, Grandma Rose, who lived with us in the boys' quarters behind the main house. She was old even then, her hands shaking when she peeled vegetables, but her mind was sharp as broken glass. Grace was the eldest, responsible, always helping without being asked. Daniel was the youngest, spoiled, sneaking tastes from every pot, until my mother swat. Christmas morning, ritual, slow, sacred Christmas morning, moved slowly in those years. My father would wake us early for prayer, his voice deep and patient as he thanked God for another year. My mother would serve breakfast quietly, already thinking about lunch preparations. The table on Christmas Day was our altar. My father sat at the head, my mother beside him. Grandma rose in her special chair with the cushion that supported her back. The rest of us filled in the spaces. Our plah, the innocence, reflective, bittersweet. I remember thinking, at maybe 12 or 13 years old, that Christmas would always feel this way, that the 7 of us would always gather. That time was something we had plenty of, like rice in the big sack my mother kept in the kitchen. I didn't know time was already counting down. I didn't know that some Christmases you remember forever, because they're the last ones that felt whole. Grace's late arrival tension building. The shift began so quietly, I almost missed it. It was the Christmas I turned 19. I had finished secondary school and was helping my mother in the market while waiting for university admission. Grace had already moved to Lagos for work. She sent money home every month, dutiful as always. Daniel was in his final year of secondary school, suddenly tall and serious, no longer the boy who stole from cooking pots. That Christmas, Grace came. Grace arrived on December 26th, carrying expensive bags and guilt in equal measure. She hugged my mother too long, apologized too many times, brought gifts none of us asked for. My father accepted her lateness without comment, but something changed in his face. A tightness around his mouth, a distance in his eyes when he looked at her. Grandma Rose, however, spoke what everyone else swallowed. "So Lagos work is now more important than family," she said during dinner, her voice cutting. Grace's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Grandma, it wasn't like that. My boss needed me to your boss." Grandma Rose repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "Your boss needed you more than your own people." My mother touched Grandma's hand gently. "Let us enjoy the food, Mama. She is here now." But the damage was done. The meal continued with forced cheerfulness. Grace barely ate, my father said, even less than usual. Daniel and I exchanged glances across the table. Both of us, Grace's confession, quiet, vulnerable that night. I heard Grace crying in the bedroom we still shared when she visited. When I asked what was wrong, she said, "I sent them money for Christmas. I thought that would be enough." She paused, her voice breaking. "But it's never enough, is it?" I didn't know how to answer. I was 19 and still believed that presents and money were separate things, that you could choose between them. I didn't yet understand that for Grace. They had Daniel's rebellion, growing tension. Daniel was changing too, though differently. He gained admission to study engineering, but struggled with the coursework. He started spending time with friends my father didn't approve of, coming home late, smelling of cigarettes, answering questions with shrugs. The Christmas of his second year in university, he brought a girl home, Linda. She was beautiful and polite, with long braids and a Lagos accent that didn't quite match the conservative CL. Grandma Rose's prophecy, ominous. Sharp Grandma Rose took one look at her and said to my mother, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That one will not marry him. She is just passing time." Daniel was furious. He and Grandma Rose argued for the first time in his life. My father had to intervene, his voice hard with disappointment. Linda left the next morning, embarrassed and angry. Daniel followed her 2 days later, cutting Christmas short. That year, only 5 of us sat at the top, my mother's breaking devastating. Slow, my mother smiled throughout the meal, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. And when she thought no one was watching, I saw her stare at those 2 empty chairs with something that looked like grief. I should have recognized that look. I should have understood what it meant. But I was young and still learning that mothers carry pain silently, so their children can be free. My first Christmas away, guilt, distance. I had my first child in October, a daughter I named Mercy. Christmas that year felt different before it even arrived. I was exhausted, struggling with motherhood, trying to adjust to living with Samuel's family in their compound, while we saved for our own place. When my mother called in early December to ask if we would come home for Christmas, I hesitated. The baby was still so small. Samuel's mother had opinions about travel with newborns. The family scatters, building to crisis. Grace called 2 weeks before Christmas. She wasn't coming either. She had been promoted to a management position that required her to work through the holidays. "But I'm sending extra money," she promised. "Enough for meat and drinks and whatever else else Mama needs. Daniel came home on December 22nd, but not alone and not as we expected. He arrived with Linda, now his wife, married secretly in a registry 3 months earlier. Without telling any, the final break intense, painful Grandma Rose refused to speak to either of them. The house that Christmas felt like a battlefield with invisible wounds. Conversations were polite and empty. Daniel and Linda stayed in his old room, barely coming out except for meals. My father retreated to his study. My mother moved through cooking preparations like a woman in a dream. On Christmas Eve, my father called Daniel into the study. I don't know what was said, but Daniel emerged 30 me. Christmas morning alone, devastating peak. We're leaving in the morning, Daniel told my mother, his voice shaking. Dad made his position clear. I'm not welcome here with my wife. My mother begged him to stay. It's Christmas, she pleaded. Whatever was said, we can fix it after the holiday. Please, Daniel, don't leave like this. But Daniel was as stubborn as our father. He and Linda left at dawn on Christmas Day, before breakfast, before prayer, before anything could be resolved. The collapse raw, heartbreaking. She sat down at the table and wept. My father came in, saw her crying, and left the room without a word. Grandma Rose, who had criticized everyone all season, said nothing. She simply sat beside my mother and held her hand. They sat like that for hours. 2 old women at a table meant for a family that no longer existed in the way it once had. I learned all of this later in phone calls and pieced together stories. Because I wasn't there either. The slow decline, somber, gradual months passed. The family stayed fractured. Grace called my mother weekly. Long conversations that left my mother tired. She sent money for everything. Repairs for the house. Medicine for Grandma Rose. Contributions toward Daniel's final year in school. But she didn't visit. There was always a reason. Work projects, travel requirements, commitments that couldn't be rescheduled. Daniel and Linda moved to Port Harcourt after he graduated. Taking a Grandma Rose fades gentle. Sad Grandma Rose's health began failing that year. Small things at first. Forgetting where she put her glasses. Confusing Tuesday with Thursday. Calling me by Grace's name. Then bigger things. Falling in the bathroom. Leaving the stove on. Wandering outside at night in her nightgown. Confused about where she was. My mother became her full-time caretaker. She stopped going to the market regularly, asking a neighbor to watch her stall most days. She grew, the visit that changed everything, turning point. I didn't understand the full weight of what was happening until I visited in July. 7 months after that broken Christmas. My mother looked 10 years older. The house, once always spotless, showed signs of neglect. Dust in corners, dishes in the sink, a general weariness in every room. But the dining table was what broke me. It was set, as always, with 3 places, but surrounding it were 7 chairs, 4 of them pushed in, the the phone calls building hope that night. After she went to bed, I called Grace. We hadn't spoken directly in months. "Grace, we have to do something," I said. "Mama is breaking." There was a long pause, then Grace's voice, tired and defensive. "I send money every month, Helen. What else can I do? I have responsibilities here, a career I've built. I can't just abandon everything because what? Because your family needs you. That's not fair. I'm doing what I can." Money. Daniel's truth, revelation. I called Daniel next. He answered warily, expecting criticism. Instead, I told him about Grandma Rose, about Mama's exhaustion, about the empty chairs. "I want to visit," he said, "but I can't face Dad. Not after what he said about Linda, about our marriage." "What did he say, Daniel? What was so terrible that you'd abandon everyone else because of it?" The story came out in pieces. My father, proud and traditional, had told Daniel he was making a mistake. He questioned that matters. Wisdom, gentle challenge. "Daniel," I said carefully, "what if Dad is wrong? And what if you're wrong? Can both things be true? And if they are, who wins when Mama is the one losing?" He had no answer. The silence on the line said everything. The death quiet. Sudden. Grandma Rose died on a Tuesday in early November, quietly in her sleep, after a morning that seemed no different from any other. My mother found her when she brought lunch to her room. Grandma in her favorite chair by the window, her face peaceful, her hands folded in her lap, as if she'd simply decided to rest and never woke up. My father called me first. His voice, usually so controlled, shook with something I'd never heard before. Not quite grief. "So, Grace returns emotional, honest." I called Grace. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. When I told her, she was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Grace, I should have visited more." Her voice was barely a whisper. I kept telling myself next month, next trip, when work calms down. She exhaled shakily. "But work never calms down, does it? You just keep choosing it until there's nothing left to choose." She booked a flight for the next day. Daniel's return, tense. Pivotal. Daniel was harder to reach. His phone went to voicemail 3 times before Linda answered instead. When I told her, I heard her relay the news to Daniel. Heard his sharp intake of breath, heard something crash in the background. "We'll be there tomorrow," Linda said quietly. "Whatever happened before, it doesn't matter now." He knows that. The reunion, powerful, cathartic. The 3 days before the funeral were the strangest of my life. All 7 of us were together in that house again. My parents, Grace, Daniel, Linda, Samuel, and me, with baby Mercy in my arms. The house should have felt full. Instead, it felt crowded with ghosts of everything unsaid. Grace arrived first, stepping out of a taxi, looking expensive and exhausted. My mother embraced her for a long time, both of them crying. Grace kept apologizing. I'm father and son. The breaking point. Daniel and Linda arrived hours later. The moment Daniel entered the house, he and my father locked eyes across the living room. Two proud men, older now, worn down by grief and stubbornness. Nobody knew who would break first. It was my father. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled Daniel into an embrace so sudden, so desperate, that Daniel's body went rigid with shock. Before melting into it, my father, who never showed weakness, the burial solemn, reflective. We buried Grandma Rose on a Thursday. The entire neighborhood attended. She'd lived in that community for 30 years, sharp-tongued and generous, critical and kind, leaving impressions on everyone she encountered. At the graveside, my mother stood between Grace and me, holding both our hands. Daniel stood on the other side with Linda and my father. 7 of us together, watching the woman who'd held our family together in her own difficult way. The revelation shocking, emotional. My mother was the one who finally spoke. "I need you all to know something," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Grandma Rose knew she was dying. The doctors told us 3 months ago. She paused, letting the words settle. She refused treatment, said she was ready. Grace gasped. 3 months. Why didn't anyone tell us? She asked us not to. My mother looked at each of us in turn. She said, "Let them come because they won." The letters, individual, personal. "She left something for each of you," my father added, his voice rough. Letters. She wrote them over the past few months, when her mind was still clear. He retrieved a small box from his study, handed each of us an envelope with our names in Grandma Rose's shaky handwriting. We opened them separately, each finding a private corner of the house. Mine said, "Helen, my quiet one. You always watched more than you spoke. You saw everything and said little." Grace's letter, convicting, loving. I found Grace crying in our old bedroom, her letter clutched in her hand. She showed it to me through tears. "Grace, my hardworking girl. You thought providing money was the same as providing yourself. I understand why Lagos teaches you that success means sacrifice. But who are you succeeding for if the people you love become strangers? Your mother doesn't need your money. She needs your time. Your father doesn't need your provisions. He needs your voice." Daniel's letter, healing, redemptive. Daniel's letter was longer. He read parts of it aloud during dinner that evening, his voice thick with emotion. "Daniel, my stubborn boy, so much like your father. Both of you too proud to bend before you break. I was hard on Linda. I judged her unfairly, not because of who she is, but because of what her presence represented. My grandson choosing his own path without consulting us old people. But here is what I learned too late. A young man who loves his dinner together, healing, hopeful. That evening, we sat at the dinner table together. My mother had cooked, refusing all offers of help, moving through the familiar rituals of feeding her family. She set 7 places for the first time in nearly 2 years. Every chair was filled. The conversation was tentative at first, careful, but gradually it warmed. Grace talked about work, but also about loneliness. Daniel talked about his marriage, but also about his regrets. My father talk, preparation, anticipation, joy. Christmas came again, as it always does, indifferent to our readiness for it. This time, we were ready. Grace came home a week early, bringing work, but leaving space around it. She helped my mother in the market for 3 days, laughing at how much she'd forgotten about bargaining with customers, reconnecting with neighbors who'd watched her grow up. Daniel and Linda arrived with gifts they'd made themselves, a photo album of their first year of Mar. He transformed father, growth, softness. My father was different, softer. He helped with cooking preparations without being asked. He complimented my mother's food, something he'd never done regularly before. He played with Mercy on the floor, his dignity set aside for joy. One evening, I found him and Daniel in the backyard, talking quietly, not arguing, not debating, just talking. Father and son, finding their way back to each other, one conversation at a time. Christmas Eve, sacred, complete on Christmas Eve. My mother brought out Grandma Rose's chair, the one with the cushion, the one that had sat empty since her death. She placed it at the table alongside the other 6, 7 chairs, she said simply. For the 7 of us, and one will always be Grandma's to remind us what we almost lost. We prayed together that evening, not the formal prayer of my childhood, but something more raw and honest. My father thanked God for second chances. Christmas morning, peace, fulfillment on Christmas morning. We woke slowly. No rush, no schedule, just presence. We ate together. The same jollof rice, the same fried chicken, the same meal my mother had made for decades, but it tasted different this time. Better. Not because the recipe changed, but because we changed. After lunch, Grace suggested something new. Let's take a picture, she said, all of us, so next year, we remember what this feels like. We gathered around my mother's piece, quiet victory that evening, as guests left and the house grew quiet. I found my mother standing at the kitchen window, looking out at nothing in particular. Mama, I said softly, coming to stand beside her. Are you okay? She smiled, tired but genuine. I'm better than okay, my daughter. I have my family back. She paused, her eyes glistening. Not the same as before, better than before. Because now we know what it costs to lose each other. The lesson reflective. Universal people talk about Christmas like it's about gifts and lights and perfect moments. But that's not what Christmas is for people like us. People who have lost something and fought to get it back. Christmas is a mirror. It shows you who's there and who's missing. It shows you what you've built and what you've broken. It shows you what love looks like when it's tested by time, pride, distance, and regret. For years, Christmas was a wound in our family. The ongoing work, honest, real. We didn't fix everything that broken Christmas, or even the Christmas after Grandma Rose died. There are still hard conversations ahead, still old wounds that ache in cold weather, still patterns we fall into when we're tired or scared. But we keep choosing each other. That's the difference. Grace still works too much, but she comes home more. She brings her laptop, but closes it for dinner. She sends money, but she also sends her time. Daniel and Lynn, this year's Christmas, present day this year, when we sat at the table on Christmas Day. My mother looked at each of us and said something simple. This is what Christmas means to me. She paused, her voice thick with emotion, not the food or the gifts. This, all of you, here, choosing to be here. She touched Grandma Rose's empty chair gently, and her memory, reminding us to do better. The room was quiet, but it was a good quiet, the kind that comes after something true has. The message direct, caring if you're watching this and your family is still whole. Don't wait for a funeral to appreciate them. Don't wait for an empty chair to realize what presence means. Call them today. Visit them tomorrow. Choose them while you still can. And if you're watching this and someone is already missing from your table, don't pretend it doesn't hurt. Honor the hurt. Let it teach you. Let it push you toward repair before it's too late. The universal truth, wisdom, gentle Christmas, has a way of showing us the truth we avoid all year. It strips away our excuses, our justifications, our carefully constructed reasons for staying distant, and it asks one simple question: who matters to you? And are you living like they do? This is not just my story. It's every family's story in some form. The details change, but the lesson stays the same. Love the people you have while you have them. Forgive what can be forgiven. The ending soft, powerful. And when Christmas comes, with all its memories and all its mirrors, let it remind you not of what was lost, but of what can still be saved. This is what Christmas means to me, not lights or gifts or perfect moments, but second chances, repair, presence, and a table full of people who chose to come back, even when it hurt, even when it was hard, even when pride said to stay away. They came back, we came back, and that is what Christmas Ray